He was the most powerful man in 3 states, and he ended up bleeding on the back seat of my 9-year-old Impala with 140,000 miles on the odometer and a check engine light that never turned off. If you think a queen needs a glass slipper and perfect timing to save a king, you are about to learn different. Hit that like button right now. Subscribe before you scroll past this, and drop your city and the time you're watching in the comments, because in the next 60 seconds, I make a choice that starts a war I never asked to be part of. 3 hours before that night, I was still just a waitress counting quarters at the bottom of my apron pocket, trying to figure out if I had enough gas to make it home. The diner where I worked, Sal's on Route 9, closed at 11, but I always stayed until midnight because the graveyard tips were better and the manager let me take home the pie nobody bought. I had rent due in 4 days and $91 to my name. I had a mother in a rehabilitation facility 2 towns over with a bill that grew every month like something feeding on me personally. $640 past, due as of that morning's phone call, a number I had memorized the way other people memorize song lyrics. I had a regular named Earl who tipped in exact change, and a regular named Big Mo who tipped like he owed the universe an apology. And somewhere between the two of them I had learned everything I needed to know about reading a stranger before they said a single word. I had learned, over 28 years of living paycheck to paycheck, that the world did not owe me kindness, and I had stopped waiting for it to change its mind. I refilled coffee, I smiled at men who didn't deserve it, and I went home every night to an apartment above a laundromat with a buzzer that only worked if you hit it twice. And I told myself that was simply what a life looked like when nobody handed you a head start. My best friend at the diner, a line cook named Renata, who had covered for me more times than either of us could count, used to joke that I had a superpower nobody would ever pay me for. I could read a table in 4 seconds flat, tell you who was about to order the cheapest thing on the menu out of pride instead of hunger, who was celebrating something they hadn't told anyone yet, who was sitting across from someone they were about to leave. It never once occurred to me, standing behind that counter with a coffee pot in my hand, that the same skill would one day be the only thing standing between a man and a bullet. That night, the parking lot behind Sal's was empty, except for my car and a service light glowing over the dumpsters. I was digging in my purse for my keys when I heard it. Not a scream. Something quieter and worse. A wet, ragged breathing, like a man trying not to be heard breathing at all. I froze between 2 cars, every instinct in me screaming to get inside and lock the doors. Instead, I turned toward the sound, because some stupid, stubborn part of me has never been able to walk past somebody hurting. Not since I was 12 years old and found my own mother collapsed on our kitchen floor with nobody else in the house to notice. He was slumped against the brick wall in the shadow of the dumpster, one hand pressed to his side, dark liquid seeping between his fingers in the sodium light. His shirt had been white once. Now it was ruined, torn open at the collar, and even in the dark I could see the edges of ink crawling up from his chest toward his throat, black lines curling like smoke around something that might have been a dragon or might have been a storm. His hair was soaked, plastered to his forehead, and there was a shallow cut above his eyebrow that had painted one whole side of his face in blood gone rust-colored and dry. He looked up at me with eyes so dark they seemed to swallow the little light there was, and for 1 second neither of us moved. Then, somewhere out past the fence line, a car door slammed, and he flinched like the sound had teeth. I did not know his name. I did not know what he had done, or who he had crossed, or what kind of men were looking for him with car doors slamming in the dark 3 blocks from my job. I only knew what my body decided before my brain caught up. I grabbed him under the arm that wasn't bleeding, hauled him up faster than a man his size should have let a woman half his weight haul him, and half dragged, half walked him to my car. He didn't fight me. Later I would understand that should have scared me more than it did. A man like him letting a stranger move him like cargo. But in the moment I only registered that he was heavier than he looked, and colder than a person losing that much blood had any right to be. I opened the back door and he folded himself onto the seat like his legs had simply stopped being interested in holding him up. I slid into the driver's seat, hands shaking so hard I dropped my keys twice before I got the engine to turn over. In the rearview mirror, I watched a man in a grey suit walk out from between the buildings across the street, scanning the lot with the kind of patience that told me he had done this kind of hunting before. Unhurried, thorough. A man who expected to find what he was looking for eventually, and had all night to do it. He didn't see us. Not yet. I eased out of the lot with my headlights off until I hit the main road, my heart slamming against my ribs so hard I could hear it over the engine, and I did not breathe properly again until his flat, ordinary shape had shrunk to nothing in my mirror. "Where?" the man in my back seat rasped, and I nearly swerved off the road at the sound of his voice, low and accented, and barely holding together. "Are you taking me?" "Somewhere they won't look," I said, because it was the only true thing I had. I glanced at him in the mirror. Blood had soaked clean through his shirt now, spreading dark across the seat. I'd spent 3 Saturdays shampooing after my nephew threw up grape juice on it. I should have been thinking about the seat. I should have been thinking about 100 smarter things. Calling the police, pulling over, walking away from whatever this was before it swallowed my ordinary, exhausted, barely holding together life whole. Instead, I reached back without taking my eyes off the road and pressed my hand flat against the wound at his side, applying the only pressure I knew from a first aid course I'd taken for a job I no longer had. "I'll protect you," I whispered, "and I meant it the way you mean a promise you have no earthly way of keeping, the way you say it anyway, because the alternative is watching someone die in the backseat of your car. Just hold on, I'll protect you." He made a sound that might have been a laugh if it hadn't cost him so much. "You don't know what you're protecting," he said. "I know you're bleeding, and I'm not the kind of person who leaves people bleeding," I said. "Figure out the rest later." We drove for 11 minutes, though it felt like 11 years, before I pulled into the cracked lot behind my apartment building. I got him up the back stairs somehow, his arms slung over my shoulders, his weight nearly folding my knees with every step, and I did not let myself think about how strange it was that a man built like a wall was letting himself be carried by a 140-pound waitress in a stained work apron. I got him through my door, onto my couch, and I locked every lock I owned, 3 of them, and stood with my back against the door for a full minute, just breathing. Then I turned around and looked at the blood on my hands and realized I had absolutely no idea what I had just brought into my home. His name I would learn over the following hour as I cut his ruined shirt away with kitchen shears and cleaned a wound that needed a surgeon more than a waitress with a first aid certificate was Daehyun. He didn't offer a last name, and something in the careful, deliberate way he withheld it told me not to ask twice. He watched me work with an unreadable steadiness that unsettled me more than screaming would have. His jaw locked tight against pain he refused to voice, his eyes tracking my every movement like a man cataloguing threats even flat on his back and bleeding. "You should be more afraid of me," he said at one point, when I pressed antiseptic into the gash at his side, and he didn't so much as flinch. "I'm a little afraid of everything lately," I said honestly. "Rent, my mother's medical bills, whether my transmission makes it through winter. You're just next on the list." Something in his face shifted, the faintest crack in the granite. "That is either the bravest thing anyone has said to me in years," he said, "or the most foolish. Ask me again when you're not dripping on my couch." By the time I finished, it was past 3 in the morning, and he was asleep, or pretending to be, breathing slow and even in a way that still didn't look natural to me, like even unconscious he was performing calm for an audience. I sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee I didn't drink and looked at my phone, at the $91 in my account, at the missed call from the facility about my mother's bill, and I wondered what exactly I had just wrapped my hands around. I found out 3 days later, and by then it was too late to give the answer back. He healed fast, faster than any man should from a wound that deep, and I told myself that was just good genetics and didn't think too hard about it. He stayed on my couch because I refused to let him leave until the stitches I'd improvised held, and because, if I was honest with the mirror, some reckless part of me didn't want him to. He was quiet in a way that filled a room instead of emptying it. On the first full day, he watched me argue with my landlord through the door about the broken radiator and said nothing until the man's footsteps had faded down the stairwell, and then he asked, mildly, why I hadn't simply called a repair service and billed my landlord for it. "Because a repair service costs money I don't have to front, even if he's supposed to pay me back," I said, folding laundry that wasn't his because I refused to let myself think about whose it was. "You learn to work around people who owe you instead of waiting on them." "That is an exhausting way to live," he said. "It's the only way I've ever lived," I said. I don't know another one to compare it to. He was quiet after that for a long time, watching me move through the small rooms of my apartment with an expression I couldn't yet place. Something between confusion and the particular ache of a man realizing an entire category of struggle existed a few feet from wealth he had never had to measure against anything. That night, while I cooked the only thing my kitchen had the ingredients for, rice and whatever vegetables hadn't gone soft in the crisper drawer, he asked about the framed photograph on my windowsill. My mother at 25 in a yellow dress, laughing at something outside the frame. I told him about the woman she'd been before the stroke, sharp-tongued and stubborn, and the reason I knew how to argue a landlord out of a late fee. He was quiet for a long moment, and then, unprompted, he told me about the ink climbing his chest and throat, the dragon coiled through storm clouds that every man in his family had carried since his grandfather first inked it onto his own arm in the back room of a shipping office that no longer existed. "It is not decoration," he said. "It is inheritance you cannot sell and cannot hide. Every man who has worn it has also worn what it costs. My father wore it into an early grave. I have spent 6 years wondering whether I would wear it into one of my own before I turned 40. Do you regret it? I asked. The ink, or the life underneath it? I regretted it 3 nights ago behind that dumpster, he said, when I thought I would die in an alley instead of anywhere that mattered. I have not regretted it since a waitress in a stained apron decided I was worth the trouble of saving. I didn't have an answer for that, so I put a plate of rice and soft vegetables in front of him instead. And he ate it like it was the finest thing he'd tasted in years, and something about the way he said thank you, quiet and entirely without performance, told me he meant it. Later that same evening, I made the call I'd been dreading to the rehabilitation facility to explain I'd need 1 more week on my mother's balance. Daehyun was on the couch with his eyes closed, and I assumed he was asleep, so I didn't lower my voice as much as I should have when the woman on the phone told me, not unkindly but firmly, that 1 more week was the limit before they'd have to discuss other arrangements. I hung up and sat very still at my own kitchen table, the way you sit when you're doing math you don't want to finish. "Your mother," Daehyun said quietly, and I startled because his eyes were open now, watching me with none of the careful blankness he usually wore. "What happened to her?" "A stroke, 4 years ago," I said, because it cost me nothing to say the facts, even when the feelings underneath them cost everything. "She needs care. I can't give her in an apartment with 3 locks and a landlord who won't fix the radiator. So she's somewhere that can, and I work every shift I can pick up to pay for it, and some months I still come up short, and that's just the math of it." "You are 28 years old," he said, "and you have been carrying that math alone." "Everybody carries something alone," I said. "You were bleeding out behind a dumpster with nobody to call either." He didn't have an answer for that, not that night, but I noticed he stopped offering me folded bills after it and started, instead, simply watching. The way I imagine a man watches a ledger he is finally reading correctly for the first time. On the second night, his phone rang, a burner I hadn't noticed him carrying, and he answered it in rapid, clipped Korean that turned the temperature of the room down 10 degrees. I only understood 1 word, repeated twice, sharp as a blade. Yoon. When he hung up, his hands were steady, but something behind his eyes had gone very still and very cold. "Who's Yoon?" I asked, because I have never in my life been good at minding my own business when the business is bleeding on my couch. "Someone I trusted," Daehyun said. Who decided trust was a weakness he could no longer afford to indulge? That was the first crack in the door. And over the next 2 days, in careful pieces, delivered like a man handing over ammunition he wasn't sure he wanted me holding, I learned who he was. Not a criminal in the way I understood the word from television, not exactly, though the line blurred more than I wanted to admit. He ran an empire built on shipping contracts and real estate holdings and investment funds that moved through half the ports on the eastern seaboard. An empire his grandfather had built from nothing and his father had expanded, and that he, Daehyun, had spent the last 6 years defending from men who circled it like it was carrion. Sang-Kil Yoon had been his second, his cousin's husband, a man who had sat at his right hand at every meeting for 4 years and smiled at every family dinner. 3 nights ago, Yoon had tried to have him killed in a parking garage 2 miles from where I found him, and had very nearly succeeded. "Why didn't you go to your own people?" I asked. "Why end up bleeding behind a diner instead of somewhere safe?" Because I no longer know who my own people are, he said, and the exhaustion in his voice was the most honest thing he had said to me yet. Daehyun has spent a year buying loyalty I thought was mine. I did not know how deep it went until men I trained myself put a gun in that garage and told me to kneel. I ran because running was the only move left that did not involve trusting someone I could no longer be certain of. I should have been more afraid, hearing that. Instead, what I felt was something closer to recognition. I knew what it was to watch the ground you stood on turn out to be borrowed. I had watched my mother's insurance evaporate the year she got sick, watched promises from people who owed her nothing, and people who owed her everything dissolve at the same rate. I understood, in my bones, what it cost a person to realize the floor beneath them had never been solid. "So what do you do now?" I asked. "I find out exactly how far the rot goes," he said, "and then I burn it out." He tried, twice, in those first days, to pay me. He offered it the way I imagine men like him offer everything, as a transaction he assumed I would understand instinctively, folded bills pressed into my hand like I was a service he had contracted. The first time I told him where he could put his money. The second time, he tried to leave an amount on my kitchen counter that would have covered 4 months of my mother's care, and I picked it up and put it back in his jacket pocket myself. "I didn't drag you off that pavement for a tip," I told him, and something about the anger in my own voice surprised me. "I'm not your waitress, Daehyun. I already have one job serving people who think money buys them the right to treat me like furniture. I'm not applying for a second." He was quiet for a long moment, studying me with an expression I couldn't place yet, something between confusion and the specific kind of relief you feel when you brace for a blow that never lands. "No one has refused my money in a very long time," he said finally. "Then you've been keeping bad company," I said, and went back to reheating rice, and did not see the way he watched me for the rest of that night, like I was a puzzle he had suddenly become determined to solve properly instead of skip to the end of. It was on the 4th day that his men found him. 3 of them, quiet and grim in dark coats, standing in my kitchen like they belonged there in a way that made my skin crawl. Their leader, a broad, silent man named Daehyun, who I would later learn had served Daehyun's father before him and had a granddaughter he kept a photo of tucked behind his phone case, looked at me for a long moment before bowing, actually bowing, low and formal, in my 1-bedroom apartment above a laundromat with a hole in the ceiling I'd been asking my landlord to fix since March. "You kept him alive," Daehyun said, in careful English. "The family owes you a debt." "I don't want a debt," I said. "I want him to leave before whoever's hunting him figures out where he went." "They already have," Daehyun said quietly from behind me, and the look on his face told me the safety I had built for us in that small apartment had just ended. He wanted to leave that night without me, to disappear back into the fortress life he came from and let me go back to mine like none of it had happened. I told him, in words that surprised even me with their steadiness, that it was too late for that. Yoon's people had a description of my car, my building, possibly my face. Whatever protection came from being invisible had already burned. Either I came with him where his people could actually guard me, or I stayed exposed in an apartment with a lock that only worked if you hit the buzzer twice. "You would be safer far from me," he said. "I stopped believing in safer 6 years ago when my mother's diagnosis came back," I said. "I believe in smarter. Smarter is staying where the people with guns are on my side." Renata called my cell twice that week, worried when I stopped showing up for shifts without explanation, and I told her, in the only version of the truth I could manage over a phone that might not have been as private as I wanted it to be, that I'd found some temporary work out of town and would explain everything when I could. She didn't believe me, not entirely, but she covered for me at the diner anyway, the way she always had, and told me if I wasn't back by the 15th she was calling the police herself. I promised her I would be. I did not know, saying it, whether that was a promise I could actually keep. That was how I ended up, 4 days after finding a bleeding stranger behind a dumpster, standing in a converted warehouse compound an hour outside the city that served as one of his family's more discreet holdings, surrounded by men who called him something that translated, roughly, to young master, and who looked at me like they were trying to solve an equation that didn't add up. I was given a room, guards at the door not to keep me in, but Daehyun insisted to keep the wrong people out, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I did not have to calculate whether I could afford to eat that day. There were 3 kinds of tea in the kitchen cabinet, and nobody in that house had ever gone to bed hungry on purpose. And both of those facts sat strangely in my chest, like relief and grief occupying the same room. Daehyun showed me to my room himself that first night, and on the way, unprompted, pulled out his phone to show me a photograph tucked behind its case. A girl of maybe 6 missing her front teeth, grinning at the camera in a red winter coat. "My granddaughter," he said. "Suah, she does not know what I do for the family. She thinks I am a driver." "Are you?" I asked. "A driver?" "Sometimes," he said, and something in the set of his mouth told me not to ask what the rest of the time looked like. "You kept the young master alive. Whatever else you become to this house, you will always be the reason I still have a job that lets me buy her winter coats. I do not forget debts like that. It should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt like standing in a house built on a fault line, waiting to feel it move. The humiliation, when it came from a woman named Daehyun, Daehyun's aunt by marriage and the compound's unofficial arbiter of who belonged and who did not. She found me in the kitchen on my second morning there, making my own coffee because I did not yet trust anyone in that house to hand me a cup without an agenda attached. "You understand, this is temporary," she said, not as a question. Daehyun has always had a soft spot for strays. It does not last. When the Yoon matter is resolved, you will go back to wherever it is you came from, and this will be a story he tells at dinners about the time he let sentiment get the better of him. "I didn't ask to stay," I said evenly, though something in my chest had gone tight and cold. "No," she agreed. "You asked to be paid, and were refused. And now you are here instead, which I suppose is a more efficient arrangement for a woman in your position. Tell me, does the diner still have your job open? Or did you already burn that bridge chasing something bigger?" I set my coffee down very carefully so I wouldn't throw it at her. "Where I come from is Route 9, off exit 14, if you want it exactly," I said. "I'll be there Tuesday for my shift, assuming nobody's tried to kill me by then. You can drop by if you'd like to keep insulting me somewhere. I actually have the right to throw you out. If you've ever had someone look at you like your whole life is a rounding error, drop your city in the comments right now. Because I want to know how many of us have stood in that exact kind of room." Haewon's mouth thinned, but before she could answer, Daehyun's voice cut across the kitchen, quiet and absolutely final. "She is not a stray, Aunt. She is the reason I am standing in this kitchen at all instead of in a drawer at the county morgue. You will speak to her as you would speak to me, or you will not speak to her." Haewon left without another word, and Daehyun crossed the kitchen to stand in front of me, close enough that I had to tip my head back to hold his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, and it cost him something to say it. I could tell, a man like him not used to apologizing for the people who orbited him. "I've had worse said to me for smaller reasons," I said. "It's fine." "It is not fine," he said. "You pulled a bleeding stranger off pavement and expected nothing. And my family's answer to that is to insult you in my own kitchen. That is not fine, Naomi. That will never be fine, and I need you to know that I see it, even when I cannot always stop it in time." Something in the way he said my name, careful and complete, like it deserved better than the way it had been thrown around lately, made the tight, cold thing in my chest loosen just slightly. And for a moment, neither of us moved away, close enough in that kitchen that I could count the fading edges of the bruise still yellowing along his cheekbone. I thought that was the worst of it. I was wrong. 8 days into my stay at the compound, Daehyun told me he needed to appear, in person, at a semi-annual gathering of the Port Authority Board, a room full of shipping magnates and investors and men whose money moved cargo through half the eastern seaboard, to prove with his own 2 feet that the rumors of his death in that parking garage had been premature. To disappear entirely, he said, would hand Yoon exactly what he wanted, a vacuum to fill with forged paperwork and quiet reassurances. To reappear too, obviously wounded, would invite the same vultures to test how weak he'd truly become. He needed to walk into that room whole, composed and flanked, and he asked me to be the one flanking him, because Yoon's people would be watching for any sign of instability, and a woman standing steady at his side read, to men like that, as a man who had already regained his footing. I wore a dress Ji-hoon's wife had altered for me in an afternoon, dark green, nothing borrowed from anyone's idea of who I should be. And when I walked into that ballroom on Daehyun's arm, I felt every set of eyes in the room perform the same quick, dismissive calculation Haewon had made in the kitchen, landing on my face, my hair, the fact that I did not carry myself like anyone they recognized from. The usual circuit of wives and mistresses, and moving on with the particular contempt of people who believe politeness is optional once they've decided you don't matter. A man near the bar asked Daehyun, within my hearing, whether I was new staff. A woman in diamonds looked at my dress like she was pricing it and finding it wanting. I had spent 6 years absorbing exactly that kind of contempt over a coffee pot, and I had learned a long time ago that the trick was never to let it reach your face. Daehyun steered me past both of them without slowing, his hand at the small of my back a steady, deliberate weight, and murmured, low enough that only I could hear, "Every one of them will remember your name by the end of the night, whether they intended to learn it or not." I was watching the room instead, the way I'd watch a dining room full of strangers on a Friday night shift, cataloguing who lingered too long near an exit, who kept checking a watch that didn't match their suit, who smiled with their mouth and nothing else. That was how I noticed the caterer. He was pouring wine at the far table, moving table to table with the practiced invisibility good service staff learned to cultivate, and he poured every glass the same way except Daehyun's, which he filled a half-inch higher, and which he did not pour from the same bottle he'd used at the last 3 tables. I had refilled enough water glasses in my life to know exactly how a person's hands behave when they are performing a service they've rehearsed instead of one they've done 1,000 times without thinking. "Don't drink that," I said quietly, my hand finding Daehyun's wrist under the table before he'd even lifted the glass. The wine. Watch his hands, not his face. Daehyun didn't argue, didn't ask why, simply set the glass down untouched and signaled Ji-hoon with a small motion I wouldn't have caught if I hadn't been watching for exactly that kind of language all night. Ji-hoon intercepted the caterer 3 steps from the kitchen door, and what came out of the man's jacket in the ensuing search was not a corkscrew. The room dissolved into the particular chaos of wealthy people discovering, all at once, that violence had been standing among them in a borrowed uniform the entire evening. Daehyun's hand closed over mine under the table, steady despite everything, and in the scramble of overturned chairs and shouting board members, he leaned close enough that only I could hear him. "You just did what a room full of my own security detail failed to do," he said. "They were watching for men who looked dangerous," I said. "I was watching for a man who was trying too hard not to." We left through a service corridor before the police arrived to take statements neither of us wanted to give, and in the car back to the compound, Daehyun did not let go of my hand once. Somewhere on that dark highway, exhausted and still shaking from adrenaline neither of us wanted to name out loud, he pressed his mouth to my knuckles and held it there long enough that I felt it in places that had nothing to do with fear. The turning point came 6 days after that, in the compound's records room, where I had gone looking for nothing more than a quiet place to call the rehabilitation facility about my mother's bill. I found, instead, a folder Daehyun's people had pulled from Yoon's private office during a raid, sitting open on a desk where someone had clearly been interrupted mid-review. I should have walked past it. I have never in my life been able to walk past anything. It was not a will. It was not a legal claim on anything. It was worse, in its way, because it was patient. A year of falsified shipping manifests, doctored ledgers, entire shell companies built brick by brick to funnel money and territory away from Daehyun's control and into Yoon's, all of it timed to detonate the moment Daehyun was declared dead in that parking garage. Yoon hadn't just wanted him gone. He had spent a year quietly hollowing out the business from the inside, so that by the time anyone noticed Daehyun was missing, there would be nothing left worth inheriting, only a shell with Yoon's name already stamped across every remaining asset. It wasn't a claim through blood or paperwork. It was theft, dressed up patiently enough to look, from a distance, like succession. I found Daehyun on the compound's rear terrace an hour later and put the folder in his hands without a word. I watched him read it, watched his jaw work as page after page confirmed a betrayal a year deep instead of a night old, and I understood, watching him, exactly what Haewon's cruelty in the kitchen had been protecting itself from. A man who had already lost the ground under his feet once, learning it had been sand for longer than he knew. "He didn't just try to kill me," Daehyun said quietly. "He has been erasing me for a year. waiting for a night quiet enough to finish it, even the wine at the gathering. He was never trying to win a war in front of that board, Naomi. He was trying to make sure there was no one left standing to contest what he'd already stolen on paper. Then we make sure there's someone left standing, I said. He looked up at me, and whatever had been carefully composed on his face since I met him slipped, just for a moment, into something raw and unguarded. We, he repeated. You heard me, I said. I already told your aunt, I'm not going anywhere until I'm sure nobody's coming to finish what they started in that parking lot. Might as well make myself useful while I'm here. If that turning point landed somewhere in your chest the way it landed in mine, type the word protect in the comments right now, because I want to see how many of us understand what it means to choose to stay when leaving would be so much easier. Useful turned out to mean more than either of us expected. Yoon had built his year of theft on the assumption that no one paying attention would notice small things: missing inventory at 3 different ports, drivers rerouted at odd hours, deliveries logged twice under different names. I had spent 6 years reading rooms for a living, watching which tables were about to stiff you on a tip and which regulars were hiding a second life from the person they came in with. And it turned out that same instinct translated, with startling ease, to a ledger full of numbers someone had tried very hard to make boring. I sat with Daehyun's finance people for 2 days, cross-referencing manifests against delivery logs long after everyone else had given up and gone to bed, arguing over spreadsheets with a sharp-tongued accountant named Priya who warmed to me somewhere around 2 in the morning on the second night when I caught a discrepancy she'd been staring at for 6 hours without seeing. He's been skimming through the Meridian Street warehouse, I said, sliding the marked-up ledger across the table toward Daehyun on the 3rd night, my eyes burning from hours of fine print. Every shipment logged there gets a duplicate manifest filed 2 days later under a company called Baynard Holdings. Baynard doesn't have an address. It doesn't have a phone number. It has a bank account, and the bank account belongs to a shell that traces back, 4 steps removed, to your cousin's husband's college roommate. Daehyun studied the ledger for a long moment, and then looked at me the way I imagine a man looks at ground that has finally, after a long fall, turned solid again beneath his feet. You found in 3 days what my own auditors missed in a year, he said. Your auditors were looking for a criminal, I said. I was looking for someone trying not to get caught, which is a different kind of looking. I've had a lot of practice. Priya, who had spent 2 days watching me work with the wary respect of someone deciding whether a newcomer deserved it, finally set down her pen around 4 in the morning on the last night and said, without preamble, that she'd never seen anyone read a spreadsheet the way most people read a room. You're not looking at the numbers, she said. You're looking at the person who typed them and what they were nervous about while they did it. That's the whole job, I said. The numbers just happened to be the customer this time. She laughed, tired and real, and slid me the last cup of coffee from the pot without being asked. And I understood, in that small, unremarkable gesture, that I had made something closer to a friend than an ally in that cold, fluorescent-lit room. Yoon's counterattack, when it came fast and desperate, the way cornered things always do. He had 2 more men inside the compound than anyone realized. Sleeper Loyalties bought a year in advance the same patient way he'd bought the shipping manifests, and on the 11th night since I found Daehyun bleeding behind that dumpster, they moved. I woke to the compound's alarm, screaming red through my window, and Ji-hoon's fist on my door, already pulling me into the hallway before I'd fully understood what was happening. Gunfire, close, in the east corridor. I didn't have a gun. I didn't have training beyond what 6 years of reading dangerous men across a diner counter had taught me. What I had was the layout of that compound memorized from 11 days of walking it, because paying attention to exits had kept me alive in worse places than this. When Daehyun went down clutching his shoulder in the chaos of the corridor, I was the one who dragged him behind the overturned records cart, the one who grabbed the fire extinguisher off the wall and put it through the face of the man coming up behind him before he could finish what the bullet had started. Somewhere behind me I heard Priya screaming for someone to get her under the desk, and I shoved her there myself on my way past, some instinct from 100 chaotic Friday night rushes at Sal's, taking over where fear should have frozen me solid. I found Daehyun in the terrace hallway, pinned between 2 of Yoon's men and the balcony rail, disarmed. A 3rd man I recognized from the raid photos, Yoon himself, standing at the end of the hall with a gun leveled and an expression of a man who believed the story was already finished. "You should have stayed a story I told at dinners," Yoon said to me, almost gently, the way you'd scold a child for wandering too far. "Instead, you had to go and matter." "You built a year of theft on the assumption nobody was paying attention," I said, stepping fully into the hallway where he could see me, buying Daehyun the half-second I needed him to have. "I've spent my whole life being underestimated by men exactly like you. It's the worst mistake you people keep making." Yoon's gun swung toward me instead of Daehyun, which was, I would understand later, precisely what I had wanted. And in that half-second of his attention diverted, Daehyun moved. It was not clean, and it was not the kind of fight you see choreographed in movies. It was brutal and close and over faster than I expected. Daehyun driving Yoon back into the balcony rail with the full weight of 11 days of fury he'd been holding at careful bay, disarming him, pinning him, not killing him, though every line of his body looked like it wanted to. He held Yoon there, forearm against his throat, and looked at me instead of at the man who had spent a year trying to erase him. "Are you hurt?" he asked, and his voice shook in a way I hadn't heard from him yet, not even bleeding on my couch. "I'm fine," I said. "Finish it." He didn't kill Yoon. I would learn later that the family's response was worse, in its way, more thorough. Within a week, every manifest, every falsified ledger, every shell company Yoon had spent a year building was handed not to the police, but to the very partners and rivals Yoon had used them to cheat, an entire network of men who had trusted him with contracts, now watching a year of quiet theft laid bare in front of the one audience whose good opinion actually mattered to men like that. His reputation, which was the only real currency in the world Daehyun moved through, was gone within the week. No one killed him. No one needed to. A man like that, stripped of every partner's trust and every port's cooperation, was already a ghost walking around in his own name, and the compound's doors, along with every other door that had once opened for him, simply stopped opening. Daehyun found me an hour after it was over, sitting on the floor of my room with my back against the bed frame because my legs had finally decided they were done pretending to be steady. He didn't say anything at first. He just sat down on the floor beside me, shoulder to shoulder, both of us still in the clothes we'd been wearing when the alarm went off, and let the silence hold what neither of us had words for yet. "Ji-hoon will keep his arm," he said eventually. "The doctor says the shoulder will heal clean." "Good," I said, and my voice came out smaller than I meant it to. "You put a fire extinguisher through a man's face tonight," he said, not as an accusation. Something closer to disbelief. "I've wanted to do that to a customer at least 4 times a year for 6 years, I said. Turns out the impulse control was the only thing standing between me and a genuinely useful skill. That surprised a laugh out of him, low and rough and real, the first one I'd heard from him that didn't have anything guarded underneath it. He reached over and took my hand, turning it palm up to look at the raw scrape across my knuckles from the extinguisher's handle, and pressed his mouth to it, slow and deliberate, in a way that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with something neither of us had said out loud yet. "I keep waiting to feel like I have used you," he said quietly. "Like every time you save something of mine, I am spending a currency that is not renewable. And every time you look at me like being useful to someone who matters to you is not a cost at all." "It isn't," I said. "Not when it's a choice. It's only a cost when somebody takes it without asking." Haewon found me on the terrace the morning after, where I was drinking coffee and trying to convince my hands to stop shaking. She stood beside me for a long moment before speaking. "I said something cruel to you in that kitchen," she said, which was as close to an apology as I suspected she had ever offered anyone. "I have known Daehyun since he was small enough to hide behind his mother's coat. I have never once, in all that time, seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. Not at the gathering, not standing over Yoon with his hands shaking. I was wrong to call you temporary. I didn't do any of it for a place at your table," I said. "I know," she said. "That is precisely why you deserve one." 3 weeks later, the compound had quieted into something that almost resembled normal, whatever normal meant for a household with guards at every door. My mother's bill had been paid in full, quietly, by a name I did not recognize on the receipt, and when I confronted Daehyun about it, he told me plainly that it was not charity. That a debt of care did not stop existing just because I refused to let him hand me cash for it, and that he intended to keep finding ways to pay it whether I liked it or not. I found, to my own surprise, that I had stopped arguing quite so hard. I drove out to see my mother that Sunday, the first visit in weeks I hadn't spent doing math in my head before I even reached the parking lot, and when the woman at the front desk told me the balance showed 0 and asked if I wanted a receipt, I had to step back outside for a minute before I could trust my own voice. My mother, who still had good days and bad ones in roughly equal measure, held my hand in hers and told me I looked lighter than she'd seen me look in years, and I didn't correct her, because for once it wasn't a lie. He found me on the terrace at sunrise, the same terrace where Yoon's plans had come apart 11 days earlier, and he did not have a ring, and I would learn later he had chosen that on purpose. What he had instead was a set of keys, plain brass, worn at the edges, the kind of keys that belonged to something ordinary instead of something owned. Route 9, he said, the lot 2 doors down from Sal's. I bought the building, not for you. With you, if you want it, a diner of your own, run the way you'd run it, answering to no manager who lets 60-hour weeks slide because he knows you need the shift too badly to complain. Renata can run the floor if you want a partner in it. I already asked her, in case you were wondering whether I understood what mattered to you. That's not a small gift, Daehyun, I said, staring at the keys in his palm. It is not a gift at all, he said. It is the only kind of debt I know how to repay properly. The kind you build with your own hands instead of the kind someone hands you and calls even. You gave me my life back 11 days after I had already lost the ground under it. I am not interested in owning you the way Yoon tried to own everything he touched. I am interested in building something next to you, if you'll let me. I took the keys. I did not take them because I needed rescuing, and I want that understood clearly, because I have watched enough of these stories go the other way to know how easily people mistake a gift for a cage. I took them because for the first time since I was 17 years old and learned exactly how little the world owed me, someone had looked at what I'd built out of nothing, my instincts, my stubbornness, the specific kind of attention 6 years of waiting tables teaches you to pay to people who think you're furniture, and decided it was worth building beside instead of around. Renata found out before I'd even finished processing it myself, since Daehyun, true to his word, had already gone to see her in person, showing up at Sal's on a Tuesday afternoon in a suit that made the whole diner go quiet and sliding into her section like an ordinary customer instead of a man who moved cargo through half the eastern seaboard. She called me that night, half laughing, half in disbelief, to ask if the terrifyingly polite Korean man who'd just offered her a management stake in a diner she didn't know existed yet was, in fact, the temporary out-of-town work I'd been so vague about for 3 weeks. You could have led with Crime Boss, she said. I'd have covered your shifts faster. Would you have believed me? Absolutely not, she said. But I'd have enjoyed not believing you a lot more than I enjoyed worrying you were dead in a ditch somewhere. The diner opens in 6 weeks. Renata is already fighting me over the menu, and Ji-hoon has taken to stopping by unannounced to make sure the contractors are behaving themselves. And my mother, on her better days, asks when she can come see it. And I tell her soon, because for the first time in years soon is a promise I can actually keep. Daehyun doesn't come by every day. The empire he's rebuilding out of Yoon's wreckage doesn't leave room for that. But he comes by enough, and when he does, he sits at the counter like any other customer and lets me pour his coffee myself. And there is something in that small, ordinary ritual that feels more like an equal partnership than any velvet box ever could. She went from counting quarters behind a dumpster to standing in the doorway of her own diner with a Korean crime boss's respect earned the hard way instead of bought. If you think the version where she saves him is better than the version where he saves her, tell me in the comments, and don't forget to drop your city and the time before you scroll on, because the next story is already waiting, and I promise you it's going to shock you just as much as this one did.